First of all, welcome to my little jungle that I've set up here. I'll be moving a few things, out of the way. Hopefully, they're not, too distracting. But to give you a little bit of insight of just that concept of how houseplants, really began when we began to have plants in the home, and then the progression towards the trend that we're seeing, and also where it's going. Hopefully, it's something that continues and carries on. And I'm a firm believer that as different, because for me, houseplants it's a different ball game versus gardening outside. But I like to think that houseplants are kind of a gateway to gardening. So I'm gonna talk a lot about that this evening, about how plants really play this role in people's lives, in the hopes that something as simple as having a plant in the home inside during this pandemic will hopefully lead to hopefully more gardeners, hopefully a new generation of gardeners that are as enthusiastic as we all are in horticulture. So I'm going to get started right away. I'm going to start my timer because I'm trying to be better at this, because it's, as some of you might know, it's very easy to just keep going, and there's a lot to talk about, and I'm going to cover a lot, but I'm going to make sure to be mindful of time, because need to go to bed. It is a school night for some folks, and I have work tomorrow. So I'm going to share my screen, and we are going to get started. All right. Here we are. Gonna shift my controls a little bit. Still getting used to this format. There's so much clutter. So here we are. So Western Horticulture Society, this is the first time I'm going to be presenting this talk, and it's something I'm putting together. I'm still fine-tuning to hopefully present again. So you guys are kind of the guinea pigs for this particular talk. I've held off on talking about houseplants for the longest time, because it's been this sort of, it's been overwhelming, to be honest with you, trying to keep up with all the information, all the different, social media, influencers and that sort of thing. I'm not one of them. I don't think I am, but it's been a bit nuts, and we'll talk about that, about the significance of social media, of what it's done to horticulture as a whole, but also in growing houseplants. So it's all about having nature at home, really, is what it really boils down to, and why we have plants in the home. And nowadays it's become, if you have the space, or even if you don't have the space, there's a way to connect with nature. And especially during this pandemic, a lot of people have really craved being out in nature. If they don't have a garden and they're living in the city and they're in an apartment, for example, houseplants have sort of been, this thing that they can, order and have delivered to their home, and explore this new world of growing plants. And so we're going to talk about this evolution, about how plants made it inside and how it became important. And then I'm going to give you, we're going to do a throwback, so to speak, and share some really embarrassing childhood photos of myself and share with you my introduction to houseplants and my own path towards my obsession, I guess you could say. I am a horticulturist, but my focus is on growing things outdoors. So it's a different realm, growing plants indoors, and I'm still making mistakes, as we all do. So that's one of the things I felt very strongly about sharing my personal story, because I think it's important that beginning gardeners especially understand and recognize their own story when it comes to growing plants for themselves, because we all have our different upbringings, our different experiences growing up. And And I just wanted to showcase just one example of that. You're going to learn a little bit more about me. And then we're going to dive into learning the basics and the keys to being successful with growing houseplants. Again, because this isn't a lot of time, I'm just really going to condense it down to the fundamental basics of what it takes to be successful with growing houseplants. And these are just my own opinions as a grower, as a horticulturist of years of growing plants. And the most comprehensive, and you might have a different idea of what is important and what isn't when it comes to these fundamental basics. But I want to put them out there. And then we're going to talk about the trends and the impacts of social media, like I mentioned to you earlier, and notice trends and the hashtag there. And it's this whole world now that we live in of basically being able to show every aspect of our life, from where we went on vacation, what we're eating. And it's so incredibly overwhelming, but also very powerful from a marketing perspective, in terms of the economy of what people are purchasing as consumers. And it's also how we're gathering information and how we're learning about what's going on. I mean, I'll be honest. There are times where Facebook is my source for current news. If I don't open my email and read the New York Times, sometimes it pops up there first. So we're gonna dive into that and talk about the trends, talking about the influencers, and all that sort of jazz. And then we'll talk about the classic favorites, some of the plants that you probably are growing or have started out with. The very first plants that you ever grew might have been houseplants. So we're going to talk about these favorites, and then we're going to talk about these highly sought after plants that if you are watching this and are houseplant aficionados, these will probably be not new to you, but maybe new for some folks as well, to give you an idea of the craze of just how insane it's gotten in terms of the houseplant trends that we're seeing. And then we're going to finish up the talk talking about the lessons learned through the talk, and where this trend will go. Like I mentioned, I'm hoping that it's something that we can sustain, and that we as gardeners and horticulturists, as plant enthusiasts, can encourage others to garden, and to also let them know that we're all still learning and we'll continue to learn. So yeah, that's the whole meat of the talk. So it's going to be a lot. I promise you it'll be fun, and hopefully you'll see something new and exciting, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So yeah, let's get going. All right, so let's start from the very basic of where this fascination of having plants indoors kind of begins. And it begins with this very simple sort of concept of having the one token plant in the room, whether it's at a doctor's office or any sort of dentist clinic, whatever. You have this sort of token plant, and the thing is, it doesn't even have to be real. I mean, if you look closely at this Fiddly Fig, like, it's not real. But surprisingly, they're actually getting much better, believe it or not, in terms of the appearances. I typically poo-poo things like silk flowers and that sort of thing, but as a floral designer, I'm trying to change my tune with them, because they obviously last much longer, and the thing is, they don't grow. That's the problem, but they're getting more and more lifelike. So, but anyway, I just wanted to showcase this to illustrate this very simple setup, this simple concept that we see again and again. And over time, we look at the house as a place of things that are pretty much static. All the furniture is there, and plants are more of an accent. They're almost like an icing on the cake, so to speak, where we know a lot of their benefits in terms of adding vibrancy and green, and they produce oxygen, take in carbon dioxide, and all those basic fundamental things. But plants are still kind of an accessory at this point. So when you look at magazines like Architectural Digest here, for example, you'll see the furniture, and the plants are always kind of just an accessory, not really very prominent. But then over time, we begin to see more groupings of plant material. And you can see things, more interesting plant palette, more plants are being kind of put together, and then you have these sort of plant combinations taking place. And then it becomes sort of this throwback to the Victorian era, for example, where this was the golden age of plant collecting in the wild, and the large, greenhouses and terrariums and that sort of thing, that really began in the Victorian area. We're beginning to see some of that, and people are really beginning to embrace this concept of having this indoor sort of plant jungle. But it's a slow evolution, as you can see. Everything here in this particular photograph, it's more emphasis on the furniture, the hardware, or if we were outside, it would be, the hardscape that we would, talk about. But here, there's a little more attention to plant groupings, attention to detail and, textures and form and that sort of thing. And then you get, again, into this phase of grouping plants together. And then you become almost wrapped, and it becomes sort of wilder in sort of its appearance, where plants begin to sort of creep and go beyond their boundaries, and people love that feeling of enclosure. I believe this photograph is a bathroom, actually. If you can get enough light in the bathroom, you can have this, jungle of a garden inside. But then we reach this point where you have this collection that begins with plants, and then you start accumulating things like pots, and things become kind of cutesy, and you've got little, tchotchkes, or what's that term? This little, they become things, and people think they're cute and adorable, and each one is sort of its own, little, like a pet almost, this living pet that just stays put, and looks attractive. We all have this connection to plants and nature that's just a part of who we are as human beings, and more we're feeling that connection, and more we want these plants in our homes. So the concept of houseplants for me was quite this gradual process. My introduction to houseplants was more something like this. So forgive this, the quality of this picture, but I think this sort of illustrates the story of my introduction towards houseplants, and a little bit about my background and where I come from. So if you are, close to like a Chinatown or a neighborhood where there's a large Asian population, you've got the hair salon, the nail salon, and oftentimes this is what you'll see. It's this sort of rambunctious, like wild, unkept, almost sort of jungle of random plants that they have in there. And it's like the most hilarious thing, because it's really common, but in a way it illustrates sort of my background and my early exposure to indoor plants, which wasn't really indoors, but it was out. So here begins my houseplant story for you all. So I'm from the Philippines, and so this, I'm actually climbing a palm tree here. This was a few years ago when I had a chance to visit my hometown and a fruit plantation that I grew up in that my dad ran. So in the background, you can see trees there. Those are mangoes. But, we had bananas, coffee, and all this sorts of things. So I was, from an early age, surrounded by this lushness of different types of plants that I, didn't really know all of them growing up, but this was my exposure, to lush vegetation, of course, tropical fruits, to which to this day I still love. And that's another reason why I'm bummed about not being able to come down to California, because you have these things so much more prolifically and so much fresher. But yeah, this was my my introduction, to plants. And so when we moved to the US, I was 7 years old when we moved to the US. I caught the gardening bug, and then I didn't really start like most people would, with like the easiest sort of houseplants. I started with what I was familiar with. And again, it's that sort of jungle, sort of feeling. So I didn't start with some of the easier things that most people will start with. I grew things that I thought would impress others, because they were more challenging to grow as an indoor plant. So here I've got a red banana, and then in the baskets that you see there are orchids. So there are a lot of native orchids in the Philippines, but those were plants that really captured the attention of a lot of people and really expensive. And I wanted that challenge because the orchids were so cool. And then if you look at this picture also, there's a variegated plant there. That's a variegated monstera. So see, I was ahead of the game before this whole houseplant trend came about. So we'll talk about this variegated monstera in a little bit. But so I was 12 years old when I had that variegated monstera. So I was like, you know, I was hip back then. But this, you know, have this variegated monstera. Unfortunately, I don't have it anymore. I actually had to sell it on eBay back then because I needed the money. So if I would have known it would have been so popular, I would have had this giant plant. I would have taken cuttings, and I'd be, you know, paying rent and or my mortgage if I had a house, if I were to propagate it, because they're not cheap. They're these collector's items that everyone wants. It's insane. So this was, yeah, these were my houseplants. I mean, forgive the quality of the photographs here. These were, you know, back in the day when I didn't have a very good camera. But I started with the hard stuff, let's put it that way. So I began with orchids. And there is an orchid there that's blooming. It's a little hard to see, but I'll show you my initial first impression and exposure to growing plants indoors. And that was the falling for the spell. And I know some of you out there are avid orchid growers. So here's a photo I never thought I'd show. So this was my early awkward teenage years with my unkept hair and big dorky glasses, and with my aunt's orchids. So I caught the orchid bug pretty early. And we talk about, and as you could tell, if you know your orchids, I was growing Phalaenopsis, which is the very common, you know, moth orchid that we see pretty much everywhere because they're so easy to find and they're so affordable. And I liked the species Phalaenopsis, so not the ones that you will see often now, but the significance of these species. This is Phalaenopsis Ballina. Is the flowers are showy, they're cute, but they're quite small. And this is Phalaenopsis violacea. But the significance of these two species are the fact that they are wonderfully, wonderfully fragrant. So who knew that a Phalaenopsis, you know, a moth orchid, would have a scent? But there are actually species that have fragrant flowers, which means there are fragrant hybrids. So the plant that you saw in that really blurry picture is this particular orchid here. This is the Phalaenopsis variety called Sweet Memory. I don't grow this anymore, unfortunately, but it was lovely. And the beauty of this was it looked like a standard Phalaenopsis, and it was as easy to grow as a Phalaenopsis, but easier to grow than the species. So I have a small collection of other what they call novelty Phalaenopsis hybrids that I have here in my collection. But so yeah, I began with the really, you know, challenging ones. And actually here, this is what I'm looking at right now. Just behind my laptop here is what you would see if you were here in person, is my setup of fluorescent LED lamps with my orchids and other houseplants. So yeah, I've got a little problem, but hey, it could be worse, right? So that gives you an idea of a little bit about me and my experience with houseplants. So I began with the tough stuff. So with that though, let's talk about some of the basics of growing houseplants in general. So these basics I basically had to learn through this process. Probably not the most recommended way of doing it because it became an expensive, you know, you make expensive mistakes, let's put it that way. But you know, I make those mistakes, and but I think everyone needs to. They have to learn at some level at some point. And I stress this, and I stress my experience with houseplants because everyone is going to approach growing these plants differently. They're going to start at some level, and it doesn't matter what level that may be. It might be the most difficult, hard to grow, you know, species, or it can be something really, you know, very common. But it's all based on these fundamental basics that we're going to talk about. And a lot of this, especially in growing houseplants, is knowing your own environment. And a lot of this will be very basic, but I like to think that there's some new gardening enthusiasts out there watching that are maybe a little bit intimidated about gardening and growing plants. This is for you. So light and temperature certainly play a key role. Since most houseplants are going to be tropicals, um, you have to understand where they come from and pay attention to light requirements and temperature. And that's the one thing too that we need to figure out is at our homes, the level of light that comes in, even though we have windows, is highly variable. So it takes a bit of doing your own homework, but a lot of it is also just experimenting. And with that comes water and humidity. Humidity we'll talk about, and I'll really emphasize because it's the one aspect of plant growth that seems to be lacking in the home, especially right now here in the Pacific Northwest. It's winter time. We have our heaters on, and I'm struggling currently to keep the humidity up in this kind of grow room that I have. But it's essential for plant growth, much as light is in terms of plants being able to photosynthesize, and of course water, which every living organism needs to be able to survive. So key important things to pay attention to. And then equipment and supplies. So the things that you need to be able to satisfy the light requirements, temperature requirements, and the watering and humidity, etc. So things like containers, do you need to have a humidifier, stakes to prop up, flowering stems, different types of pots and that sort of thing. It can be a very expensive hobby, but it doesn't have to be. And one thing I'm seeing right now in terms of this houseplant trend is it's very marketable, and people will just sell you the most absolute junk out there, in my opinion. I mean, I shouldn't say it, and I shouldn't be too critical, because sometimes a lot of these are, they mean well in the success of one's personal path towards growing plants. But I see a lot of them and thinking, yeah, that's no. But again, my own personal take on that. And then let's talk about plant sanitation. Another key thing too to keep in mind, because as plants grow, you're going to be encountering pests and diseases. So we're not going to cover too much of that this evening, but it's important to understand that you're going to be dealing with these problems when you're growing houseplants. So the best thing to do really is to make sure that you're starting with healthy plants. And even from reputable sources, they might have hitchhikers that come with them that you need to be aware of. So to lessen the problems that you're going to have with growing plants in the home, is to make sure to prevention is the key. That's the word I'm looking for, is prevention. Everything you can do to prevent pests and diseases from occurring is critical. And that often begins with making sure that the plants are clean. So you basically have to treat them as if they potentially have COVID or something like that, where you may want to make sure you quarantine your plants in an area in the home to wash the leaves, inspect the roots and soil and that sort of thing, so you reduce the potential of having a pest and disease potentially getting to your other plants as well. So that's another thing, another key guide to being successful. And also I put in schedule. Oh, schedule. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, I talk about like a schedule, like our daily schedules, and how involved do you want to be in terms of growing houseplants? Because there are, it can be a full-time gig, and I'm years and decades away from retirement, so I don't really have the luxury of just being able to garden and grow plants. God, I wish. But be realistic about how involved you want to be in terms of what type of plants you get and want to nurture in the home. Do you go with something that requires more care, or do you want something that's going to be almost like furniture that you can only tend to, every few weeks? So it's something to keep in mind. It's very easy to get very enthusiastic and, buy, and then all of a sudden, you're overwhelmed. And so that's something to definitely keep in mind. And the last bullet point I want to make is patience. As gardeners, It's one of the things that gardening teaches us is to be patient, understand that plants grow and plants grow at different rates, and also the diversity of plant material that exists out there requires that we take our time. We learn, we watch, and we learn to observe. So sometimes we see, most people will see houseplants as just furniture and that they don't move. But then when you begin to see growth, then you expect it to really take off. But then some do, some don't. Patience is certainly key. So those are my key points to success in growing houseplants. So, all right, we know the fundamental basics. We have an exposure. We've got that early bug, whatever that catalyst would be for you in terms of growing plant materials. Let's talk about this crazy trend that's going on and the impact of social media that's taking place. So right now, what we're seeing is this hashtag evolution, where everything is visible, very open, very transparent in how people garden, and there are people that make it known. They'll take pictures of themselves, in the shower with their plants, and it's just nuts. But it's this concept of the urban jungle. It's so trendy, and it's becoming this lifestyle, and also with the younger generation too. Some are starting families, but also some are choosing not to have families, but instead have their plant babies. And so they become plant parents. So, of course, like a child, they've got their plant and they want to, show it at 6 months, show it at 1 year, and all the little quirks and, oh, look what my friend is doing, and all these things. It is obnoxious and silly, but at the same time, it's a thing. It is really, really funny to observe, and a little overwhelming. But then you have these influencers. Then here's just one example. I feel like anyone that has good lighting, that has access to a lush assortment of different plants, and you know how to work a camera, you look good in the camera, you're willing to take your shirt off for a camera, like you can be one of these like influencers. And I don't know, I try not to be too overly critical about it, because at times I think excuse me, like, oh, maybe I'm just jealous of all that's going on. But the thing is, again, as these influencers kind of come into play, again, it's this lifestyle that people really gravitate to and people want to emulate. And in a way, they're doing it in their own sort of unique way, in their own style, in their own, pizzazz, their own personality, and it really shows through. And where I get really critical of these influencers is making sure that they're sharing correct information, because it's very easy for them to just sort of glaze over it, or sort of dumb things down, which I am not a big proponent of. So I'm always on alert and trying to make sure that they're sharing correct information on top of their over the top ness that they present. And you have all these different personalities, so it's become this market and it's become this trend, and these influencers are making money. So maybe that's where I'm jealous, where like they're making money and I'm not. But you know what, it's it's their own thing. I've just got to focus on myself, right? But yeah, they have sponsors, and and of course they're promoting all these products. Some of them are crap, to be honest, but some of them are actually quite nice. So anyway, it's a thing, is what's going on. And the beauty of all of this is now we're beginning to see folks that never really even considered or thought of a plant, all of a sudden very curious about and want to try to grow plants. So it's been fun. But what is crazy to me is the insanity of the plant market now. So this was at the Northwest Flower and Garden Show last year, actually before the whole world shut down, basically. We snuck in our Northwest Flower and Garden Show, and of course, houseplants were a hit. and it was just insane. It was fun to see the chaos and the interest, but to me, it was the sticker shock and the price of some of these plants just blew me away. Even the most common stuff were fetching prices that I was like, oh, I am not paying that much for, you know, a spider plant or something like that. It's really was crazy. So with all that, you might ask, when did this surge in popularity like really begin? Like, so to answer that question, it certainly was in the last couple of years, but then you ask, and how? You know, how did this all really begin? So there might be different opinions on this, but from my personal observation, pretty much living and breathing plants and flowers, you know, 24/7, here's where I thought it began: the succulents. And they're still quite popular to this day, and became very trendy. And it's funny because when people would ask about houseplants and what to start, most people would think that, oh, a succulent would be great because they don't take a lot of water and they're small and they're cute. But I always discourage folks from getting succulents because most people tend to not have enough light for them to really thrive. But what seems to have happened is people discovered them as a plant that took the longest to die. Let's put it that way. You know, and it's true. You know, you can have a succulent that looked great and that looks great, you know, for quite a while until it eventually kind of peters out. But then, you know, you would have had that, you know, that was sort of a starting point for a lot of people. And there were so many different kinds, and you can share them, you know, with folks, and they were just cute and highly marketable, and they were everywhere. So then you have places like Flora Grub, you know, down in San Francisco, for example, that made them, you know, this, you know, a whole lifestyle of plants, and they do such beautiful work. I love going down to Flora Grub to kind of see, you know, what the urban gardener is looking for. I get a lot of great ideas, and it kind of keeps me up to date because, you know, they're doing their homework and as to what consumers want. But I think this is where it really started. So I've been growing succulents, especially hens and chicks, these sempervivums, for years in containers. And it's funny how even a simple composition of sedums and hens and chicks like this, like any garden center, these would be, you know, sell like hotcakes basically. But to me and to a lot of us, it was just something really just sort of, you know, basic. But then I know I paid attention. I grabbed hold and began to integrate and use more succulents in my work. And as a floral designer, we were seeing them in floral arrangements and in wedding bouquets and that sort of thing. So I started integrating them in my work. So succulents and also air plants as well. So things that are very textural and things that, yeah, you know, lived without soil, took the longest to die, or even when they're dead, they look good. So these sorts of things became really popular, and I tried to adapt to this aesthetic. So then I began to use them in my work, like this Echeveria, for example. A little bit of wire and florist tape, began using them in my floral work. But then this is where the horticulturist kicks in, where I think this is the gateway that I was telling you about earlier, actually begins, is when you have a floral arrangement like this, bouquet, with a succulent in it, while everything else fades, you can save those succulents and grow them, yeah? So take this Echeveria, for example, used in a bouquet, enjoyed, and then everything else fades, you save them, then you can grow them at home. You can save those cuttings, pot it up, and then now you've got a plant. And now you're a gardener, and now you're trendy. So this is that same Echeveria now growing in soil. So given that interest and the surge in popularity of succulents, of course, you know, market has to satisfy the demand. And from then, so let's say the succulents, you know, they discovered, yeah, maybe not a lot of light, didn't do too well, but I like this concept of growing plants inside. Well, what's gonna work? Well, here we are. And in a way, probably where a lot of beginners can begin, when growing plants indoors. These are some of the most popular, classic, time-honored favorite houseplants: the spider plant, the Boston fern, the mother-in-law's tongue, or the snake plant, the Sansevieria, the Spathiphyllum, the peace lily, dracaenas, all these things. I'm not going to go into too much detail about these, but these are your sort of go-to, beginner introductory houseplant 101 plants that most people are very successful at. So then, given that, of course, they had to boost the numbers of those plants. You can see the snake plants there in the lower left, and things like pothos, the spider plants, and that sort of thing. Again, to satisfy this growing trend and this growing desire for this, green lifestyle indoors. So then you get into the plants that somehow, some way, have become the most popular and like sought after. And it's one of those things that I just sort of that plant, sort of reaction to some of them. Because to us, to a lot of experienced growers, these are super common, but how they become so popular is really fascinating to see. So let's talk about each of these. Ficus lyrata, remember that one single plant that we started in the very beginning? This one looks real. So the Fiddly Fig, still very popular, and made popular because of those pictures from Architectural Digest or any of those, Better Homes and Gardens, Martha Stewart, all these magazines. Inside the home typically will have this ficus, in the back corner where it's tall. And to this day, it's still really popular, but it's a really tricky plant. From my own personal experience and from talking to other houseplant enthusiasts, they still sell, they're very popular, but they're tricky in that they're very particular about their light, their temperature, making sure that they're evenly watered, and they don't like being, moved around and transplanted. So it's tricky to get them established. And if you look here, they can get quite large. I mean, in a houseplant setting, they probably won't reach that, but keeping that in mind, is something to factor in when you're deciding on growing plants. So it's unique in itself. It's very lush, very tropical, but and very popular, but not the easiest to grow. The Monstera, probably the most iconic of the houseplants that you'll see here because of its leaf. It's so distinctive. I mean, I started this presentation with a Monstera just because it's become the most iconic houseplant there is to grow. And they can get quite large too. And it's funny, out of all the plants I have here, I actually don't have Monstera deliciosa. I feel like I should grow it, but then at the same time, I'm also scared that if I grow it and then it doesn't do very well, that I'm not, the best representatives. Like, wow, Riz is talking about houseplant, but he can't keep Monstera deliciosa alive. So I'll get one eventually. But to be honest, I'm just waiting for the price for them to come down because they've gotten really expensive. But in general, they are adaptable. And again, I've grown them before, so I shouldn't fail again, but you never know. But they get huge. But they give that instant lush, jungly, tropical look that everyone's after. That's why they're still very popular to this day. And the same with the philodendron. And the philodendrons here too, you might confuse this with a more commonly known pothos. One thing to keep in mind with philodendron and with pothos, which I'm going to talk about next, is they're often sold as these hanging baskets of trailing plants. But people forget that in the wild, these are actually vines and they'll actually climb up. But they're easier to sell as a hanging basket plant because it's less labor than having to train it up, a bamboo stake or whatever to sell them. So you'll often see them hanging like this, and you can use them hanging like this, but after a while, they're going to want to be able to climb. So this particular philodendron, Hederaceum, the heartleaf philodendron, one of the go-to easy plants to grow that I highly would recommend to anyone. So readily available, easy to find, still relatively affordable, I think. And the same goes for Epipremium, which is the classic, very well-known pothos, and another plant very similar to the philodendron in that it's often sold as a hanging, trailing plant, but you will actually see it climb. And as you can see, it has the common name of devil's ivy, and I'll show you on the next slide why it's called that. But again, very resilient, easy to grow, very commonly available. But keep in mind, this was in Hawaii. It's known as a devil's ivy because in a way behaves like ivy in that it's actually become invasive in tropical regions around the world where it's not native to. And you can see it here climbing up the trees and just, taking over. But as a houseplant, it's reliable and very easy. Sansevieria. Another very common, I call this a shopping mall when there were still shopping malls before they've all kind of closed down. You see like the mass drifts and plantings of these, in a mall. And they're in that condition and because they can withstand those conditions. With low light, they'll withstand very, forgetting the water, and they'll still look like, they'll still look good. And if there was ever a plant that looked like furniture, because you treat it like furniture, it would be the Sansevieria. And I have Sansevieria / Dracaena here because I just learned in doing a bit of research for this talk that they've actually moved Sansevieria over to the genus Dracaena. And I don't have a photo example of a Dracaena, but it's another very common houseplant. It's often a bare cane with strap-like leaves that are kind of look like a fountain. It's also known as a fortune plant. And another Dracaena you might be familiar with is the lucky bamboo that you'll see in a lot of Asian markets where it's in water. It's often braided and it looks like bamboo, but then it has the leaves up top. It's not a bamboo, it's actually a Dracaena. So again, Sansevieria, very easy. And then you've got the Zamioculcas, known as the ZZ plant, another one very similar to the Sansevieria where it's pretty easy to grow. I've never grown it, to be honest, but again, it's one of those hashtag trending sort of plants. And then you've got the Pilea peperomoides, that's a mouthful, the Chinese money plant. Easy. I've actually never grown it. I've just heard that it's easy, but also it does prefer high humidity. So most people may struggle with it, find out what's going on, what's wrong. It's probably not humid enough, but it's, again, cute and trendy. So people will try them in the glass like terrarium, for example. So those are some of the more kind of trending favorites that everyone kind of clamors to get. But then I want to talk about some of these collectors. Plants that people pay a lot of money for. And I sort of cringe and roll my eyes at these because at some point, like these were affordable. These weren't that common. People didn't really know what they were, didn't really care. And now you see the price tag on some of these. It's just nuts. So let's talk about Anthurium. I think a lot of people know, have seen Anthuriums, especially as a cut flower. Very waxy spades here in the aroid family, very long-lasting cut flower, and then and pretty common house plant, but most people know it as the flower. But then the beautiful thing about the houseplant craze is not so much about the flower. Like in gardening outdoors, we often think about, oh, flower, flower, flower. A lot of the younger garden houseplant enthusiasts are paying more attention to foliage, which is a wonderful thing. And then with that, they've discovered just how cool some of the foliage is on some of these Anthuriums, whether it's Anthurium clarinervium, crystallinum, and in this particular Anthurium as well. I'm still learning how to say this. Warockianum. So again, they get quite large. They're beautiful, obviously very trendy. And you probably saw my picture with it in the promotion for this talk. Again, I don't grow these. I used to grow Anthurium clarinervium actually. Long time ago, I don't anymore, but they're tricky. These are really difficult plants to grow when they don't have the right conditions, which means high heat and high humidity. So, but still, like you'll have plants of Anthurium clarinervium in a 4-inch pot with maybe 2 leaves, or maybe even like 1 leaf, and they've been selling for like $200, $300. I kid you not. It is insane. And what breaks my heart is sometimes you'll have maybe like a beginner thinking, oh, it's a cool plant, I'm gonna buy it, and then have it fail on them, is hard. There's an expensive, lesson, to learn. But it's nice that we can see this appreciation for foliage and variegation and that sort of thing. But again, you have to do your homework if you want to be successful with these particular plants. And same goes with Philodendron Pink Princess. I've grown Pink Princess for many years, actually not as a houseplant, believe it or not. I like actually using this plant. I'll buy it in the houseplant department, but I use it for outdoor containers during the summer as an annual color container. So it's trailing, it's beautiful, it can be vining, really cool plant. Actually have one here that I've rooted from a cutting because they can get quite tall. So I decided to chop it up. And yeah, so this plant will be paying my rent for next month. No, I'm just joking. They're not that expensive, but they're getting up there. It's so funny. Like, oh, do you grow Pink Princess? And I'm just like, yes. But it's hilarious to me of how popular these plants are. The more unusual the color, the more unstable the variegation, the more people seem to want these things. But I think it's also a good lesson for them to learn about how variegation works, etc. So in some ways, I was reunited with my variegated Monstera, but this was actually in Hawaii, and Monstera deliciosa, excuse me, Thai constellation is the go-to Monstera, like must have. Okay, I've got the plain green one, but I have to have this variegated one because everyone else has it. So it's a neat plant, and again, really expensive if you can find it. But I've heard rumors that they've been tissue culturing this. So what that means is growing it in the laboratory and propagating it by the bazillions. Well, let's say a few thousand. So hope maybe we'll see it basically inundate the market, which is, again, can be both good and bad. Good in that it's more accessible, it's not as expensive, but then you've got a product, a crop that's, you just saturate the market with it. And then it kind of, loses its value, unfortunately. And let's hope that doesn't happen because it really is a unique plant that grows pretty well. It's very sensitive at times to watering and also light, because when you have more white in the variegation, the more likely it is to burn. And to get damaged if the lighting isn't correct. And which is actually in the next plant that I'm going to show you is the classic case. So have you seen a variegated banana? This is the Musa AA, as it's pronounced, I believe is the proper pronunciation, known by only a handful of collectors that have it. And I believe in Hawaii, only royalty could grow this plant and eat it. And the fruit itself is variegated. It's absolutely stunning. I actually have one that was gifted to me by a friend of mine. That had a small pup of it, and it's very tricky to grow. It's very temperamental in terms of watering, light and warmth that you need to keep it going. But still, as gorgeous as this is, any of the few plants that find themselves in the market, at eBay or whatever, are fetching very, very high prices for this because they're, it's one of those things where everyone else has all the basic stuff. They need something different. They want the newest, latest thing, and or the most sought after and rare, and this is certainly one of them. So given that, we've got all these trends and all these plants that people are looking after and looking for, etc. I like to think that we're also exposing them to plants that are throwbacks, way back when, that I could remember from my childhood. So let's call these plants plants that grandma used to grow, sort of deal. And two main plants that my own grandma grew, my own Lola grew, were begonias and also African violets. So two very common, very old-fashioned plants that I would like to think are in for a comeback. And because they have their own unique and special qualities, and also with the work that's been going on, it's not that they stopped at a certain point. There are still a lot of, like African violets, for example, breeders that are continuing to grow these plants and make them more unique and more better, and better. So old-fashioned plants like, the polka dot begonia is becoming very, very popular amongst the influencers out there. And Rex begonias too are making a big comeback because of their colorful leaves. I cannot grow a Rex begonia, to be honest with you. I'll use them in annual containers and pots, but I just can't get the humidity right. They just mildew. I'm terrible. Gryphon there does a little bit better. But yeah, begonias are becoming very highly collectible now. And then these are the rare ones that people will look for too. Begonia ferox and the ever so popular, highly sought after, very difficult to grow, Begonia Darth Vaderiana. I'm not kidding you, that's its name. I don't know who got to name this very rare begonia, but that's its name and all the collectors want it. But very, very tricky to grow. So, but yeah, what's wrong with the classic purple African violet? I don't know. To me, I mean, this was sort of part of my childhood too. To just see, to go to my grandma's house and see her African violets, because they're such a treat. And this is my humble little collection at home, and you can see I fell in love with this type that was purple with a green fringe on the center. So I've been collecting this particular type of African violet. And but to me, the color range in African violet is tremendous. You have the variegated leaves, for example, which again becoming very popular. So they're beautiful with not in bloom. But the flowers on some of these, oh my gosh, I have one that has a flower that's almost 3 inches wide. And when was the last time you saw an African violet that size? Come on. So I would like to think not just African violets, but other gesneriads too, and that whole family are going to be hopefully become more popular and more widely grown as houseplants. But to me, the fun thing about African violets, or the fun thing about growing plants in general, is being able to grow them and propagate them. So I remember one of the early garden books that I got had this little diagram of how to send an African violet leaf through the mail to share it with, with a friend or with a loved one. And how fun is that, to be able to just give a leaf to a friend and have them root it and see the little babies grow and eventually flower. This was one of my first loves growing up, was being able to propagate plants. So yeah, and the African violet is the classic plant to do so. So we're nearing the end, but I want to also bring up a few of my favorite plants that I tend to be overlooked, but I think are fantastic plants to grow. And some of these plants, you'll probably look and think, oh gosh, Riz, I have those in my backyard or whatever. Like, what's the big deal? But to those that can't grow them in their backyard, they're almost indestructible houseplants. And let's start with the Espadistra, the classic cast iron plant. So I've got one here with me. This one's called Milky Way. You can see the spots there. Well, it's actually the one in the picture there too. And these are actually hardy for us here in the Pacific Northwest. We can grow them out in the garden in a protected spot, but they're wonderful, evergreen, really tough plants. And they have wonderful variety. I've got a little collection going of them now. And so they've been wonderful. And in dry shade in particular, they've been very adaptable plants. And this is one of my favorites, actually. This is Aspardistra Um Acai. And you can see the variegation and the white at the tips of the leaves. And these are the funnest plants to watch come up, because when they come out of the ground, they're like white little candles when they come up, and then the leaf develops. And then you have this very subtle, beautiful, and subtle but yet dramatic as well, variegation on a very easy to grow plant or perennial outside. And it's one of my favorites, and I love using it in floral design as well. Let's talk bromeliads. I know there are a handful that are very hardy in your region, so I'm very envious of how you can grow a lot of bromeliads. So one of my wonderful garden friends and mentors is someone you probably know, Marcia Donahue. She convinced me to buy a bromeliad when we went to the dry garden. And I still have it with me, and it's gotten done very well. But it was this beautiful. It's an Acmea Aztec Gold, it was called. Beautiful variegation, had a pink tint to it. It was gorgeous, and I'm glad to this day to still be growing it. But over there, it's you have the intensity of light that allows the bromeliads to really color up and do beautifully, even outdoors. I'm very, very envious of what you're able to grow. But for the time being, I have them indoors. They spend outside in the summer, where they can really color up. And the Bilbergias too are wonderful. Acmea, Neoregelia, all sorts of wonderful, wonderful bromeliads and Talanzias, even air plants. I've got a little collection of growing, but they're wonderful in leaf, and also when they come into flower, they're also really quite striking. But the foliage itself too speaks to itself. Variesia are absolutely wonderful, easy to grow. I again love growing these outside during the summer, and make for wonderful house plants as well. And again, I could do a whole talk on bromeliads if we could, and if we had time. But again, some of my favorites. And then one favorite that I've not seen take off yet in terms of, it's still too much an older, old-fashioned kind of plant that people are not coming around to just yet, is the clivia, or you might say clivia, but it's actually pronounced clivia after Lady Clive, I believe. But it's been one of my favorite houseplants because I love the foliage. It's very structural, strap-like, very beautiful, clean, waxy, and it's beautiful when not in bloom. And when it does bloom, it's like this wonderful icing on the cake when they flower. So they're absolutely stunning. And their most common is Clivia miniata, which is the typical orange form. But then you've got the wonderful rich yellows that used to be so, so expensive back in the day, but now they're breeding them and propagating them that they're fairly readily available now. If orange isn't your thing, you can have them, this wonderful rich butter yellow. But I think they get overlooked because the foliage is too plain, I think, for some people. But wait a second, it comes in variegated as well. So these are a little harder to find, but they do exist and they are out there. Beautiful variegated clivias that, again, hopefully will become a little bit more popular. And then, of course, we've got to talk about ferns. I'm surrounded by ferns all the time, all different types that exist, that grow there, that I have many wonderful favorites. And they're very versatile. There's basically a fern for any situation, whether it's indoors, outdoors. There's tropical ones, hardy ones, some that prefer more sun, some are dry shade, some you can grow in a moss ball. And they're just very versatile, very beautiful plants. So again, I could do a whole fern talk, yeah, and just because of their versatility and how we all just connect to ferns for some reason. Everyone absolutely loves them. So we're nearing the end. That was a lot of information and a lot of different plants, but hopefully fun. I know it's not, I hope to not overwhelm you with the different variety out there, but I want to wrap things up by talking about some of the lessons that I continue to learn, and that hopefully new houseplant growers will take to heart. So like I mentioned, houseplants have become a wonderful gateway to gardening, and I feel like our mission and our job as avid gardeners, whether you're novice or professional gardeners, to continue this trend in a way, to continue to educate others and to encourage others to continue growing plants, whether it's indoors or out. So being able to grow houseplants is a good way to understand the basic needs of plants: light, air, water, humidity, the importance of temperature, and all these sorts of things. We can learn all these lessons by just growing houseplants. And understanding plant diversity, I think, is very key. And understanding that, much like people, plants are also very diverse, with different backgrounds, different cultural requirements, and different struggles. You know, not all of them are created equal, and it's important to understand that, to take that lesson by growing plants and then seeing the diversity, seeing that in ourselves and as people as well. So it's important to to emphasize that, especially nowadays, and continuing and moving forward to have diversity be a core value in our lives, both as people and as gardeners. And in growing plants too, it's a good lesson in, botanical plant nomenclature, how plants are named, understanding how the names come from and where the names come from with plants. I try not to get too critical of the mispronunciation of a lot of different plants. I just kind of, I'll just chuckle lightly and how, plants are pronounced. But, things like, clematis versus clematis. I mean, shouldn't have to fight over it. But anyway, it's a good introduction to learn plant names by growing houseplants. And then as we've seen too with the trends, understanding economics, understanding things like plant conservation, for example, and preservation, and how by being a gardener and by growing these houseplants, you are playing a part in preserving and maintaining these plants that may not exist in the wild anymore due to, deforestation, climate change, whatever the issue might be, and that by having the skill to be able to grow a plant, that you are playing a role in the conservation and the preservation of a plant, no matter how common it is. It's a good feeling to know, and it's another value to instill in gardeners as well. And of course, too, understanding the importance of community, the importance of collaboration, and continually always learning, I think is the key thing that we want to take away from growing plants. And being able to share plants information, to see the enthusiasm of plants at every level, encouraging both young and old to mentor, one another, to experience plants at different levels. So I love these images of, that was my friend Jeff and one of our mentors, Doug Ewing, who was the greenhouse manager at the University of Washington Botany Greenhouse. And here at our local conservatory, pre-COVID, of course, when they were still open, seeing this group of young ladies down on their knees, taking a closer look is so encouraging. And it's important that we just nurture this as best as we can. Even during a pandemic, we have this opportunity to still share this information. So there it is, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for your time, your patience, and oh gosh, I wish I was there to see your faces and to hear your reactions. And I'm not just talking to a screen, but I leave you here, from my little garden oasis of the different plants that I grow. But again, this is just in some ways kind of a beginning of a new chapter, of a new phase. We all have our plant phases, right? Of continually learning about what's growing on, what we can grow both inside and out. And I hope this talk has inspired you or motivated you to, get one more plant, and just try something new and try something different, or at the very least, pass on the information and share what's kind of going on in the world. It's a wonderful, in a way, distraction of everything else that's been going on, to just be with plants, to learn to nurture and to learn to grow. And I think it's our mission as gardeners. So thank you all again so much. Here's some contact information to stay in touch. Please visit my website and follow me on social media. If you're on social media or Instagram, Twitter and all that jazz, at RHR Horticulture. And learn a little bit more about kind of, what I do. And if you have questions and that sort of thing, DM me, as they say, direct message, or at my website, send me an email and that sort of thing. So yeah, let's continue to learn. And thank you all again for your time and hearing me talk about houseplants.
Thank you, Riz. You did a wonderful presentation there, very enjoyable.
Thank you.
If you don't mind, there are a few questions, if you could answer them for them. First one I have here is if you could tell us about more about where you work now and what your professional role is at the moment.
Yes. So I'm one of those classic horticulturists that wear a lot of different hats, and we all kind of have to because, and if if you work in the field, it's not the biggest money maker. But my main bread and butter is I work as a gardens manager for a company called McMinimans. And they are a hospitality, pub, brewery, hotel, restaurant chain based out of Portland, Oregon. And they have multiple properties throughout Oregon and a handful in Washington. And I work at one called the Anderson School, which was a former junior high school that they converted, the whole school complex, they converted into restaurants, hotel, we have a pool, we have a brewery on site, and we have gardens, and I manage the gardens there. And on top of that, as you see, I also run RHR Horticulture, which is my own independent horticultural enterprise, which involves speaking and lecturing and teaching. I'll do some consulting work here and there, and I also moonlight as a floral designer. And so obviously last year I had no weddings or anything like that, but talk about gateway to plants. Cut flowers was the gateway to horticulture for me, wanting to grow my own flowers. So do a little bit of everything. But yeah, McMinimans is the garden that I speak about, which pays most of the bills at the moment. But then I dabble in other things as well.
That's really interesting. Thank you. In your bio, they talked about the school, and I thought, that sounds really weird. The school that's a pub and hotel, but that's interesting. They can put an elementary school into that.
Yes, and the principal's office is now a bar.
Wow. That's pretty funny. So somebody else complimented you on your arrangements. They are gorgeous.
Yeah.
Another question is, how do you increase the humidity in a room?
Thank you. Very good question. So I mentioned I'm struggling with keeping up the humidity in my current living situation because we have the heat pumps, going, and so I'm renting right now. I live in a mother-in-law, lower level, so the lighting isn't so great. But yeah, it's been challenging keeping the humidity up. And there's many different techniques that that you'll learn or learn about when raising the humidity. And the most classic one is basically taking a plant and putting it in a saucer with pebbles, and then basically have the pot standing on top of pebbles and having it and have water underneath it. So that's one way to help. And there are some growers that like to mist their plants, and in some ways, some growers will say, "Oh, that's just a waste of time," whatever. But I still do because well, one, I have a mister and it doesn't hurt, and I think it does help a little bit in keeping the leaves clean and increasing the humidity. But really what you need, it's over here actually, I have a humidifier, and there's many different brands out there, and of course, with the houseplant trend, they're becoming very, very popular. To be able to determine the level of humidity, again, deciding what plants you want to grow. But yeah, going with the humidifier for sure will certainly help that. But if you don't want to go to that expense, you can basically, mist away or do the saucer and container method with the pebbles. Or another recommendation that a grower friend mentioned to me too is just having shallow trays of standing water kind of around the room where the water can just evaporate and add to the humidity. So I haven't found that effective because, one, I step on the saucers and make a mess, and plus it's not the greatest thing to have also too, especially during the summertime if you have mosquitoes and other bugs and that sort of thing, isn't the most effective. So I'll just do the whole saucer tray thing with my plants if I couldn't have a humidifier.
Thank you. Another question, could you talk about how to get a Talanzia to bloom?
So it's funny, when I talk about Talanzias, I never think of Talanzias as blooming plants. Like I like them like this. This is how I grew up with them. And when they bloomed, it almost was like, what's happening? But generally, it really depends on the species in order to get them to flower. Some are more prolific to bloom than others. It really just depends on what type. But a lot of it really depends on the cultural conditions. Obviously, as long as they're happy, as long as they're getting ample light, again, depending on the different species that you have growing, will trigger it into bloom. And sometimes, especially in your region, they have more of a season, I think, down there where they can flower, and they're more prolific at different times of the year, and to help initiate flowers. But it's really variable. Again, like I said, depending on species, but certainly increasing your light will help flowering. But also keep in mind the age too. Talanzia has to be a certain age in order for it to be reproductive to send out a flower spike. So again, that's going to vary. And I don't know too much about temperature in terms of if it needs a drop in temperature or a fluctuation in temperature to trigger a blooming on a Talanzia. With certain orchids, that's the case, but with the air plants, I'm not really, I don't know exactly. But that would be my answer to that question, is making sure that it has ample light to bloom and to know what kind of Talanzia to have to understand its blooming behavior and its blooming season.
Okay, good advice. Somebody asked what houseplant you're hunting down, something that you would like to find. What are you lusting after right now that you don't have?
Oh gosh, I haven't been asked that question in a while. I think, so I was talking about the orchids, right? The novelty hybrids and the species and that sort of thing. There's a few I'd like to grow, but I need to, watch it in terms of, my horticultural salary. There's, oh gosh. I don't know, I think I've reached that point where I'm not that like, oh, I must have, like a certain plant. I'm kind of letting all the influencers kind of, deal with that. I just figured, oh, if I can get it, well, great. I just have to make sure that I can, keep it alive. There really isn't, well, there actually is one that I used to grow, but I don't anymore because I couldn't keep it growing as a houseplant. And that is the elusive blue Amaryllis, believe it or not. The genus is Worslea, and Worslea, I believe is the spelling. Anyway, but just Google blue Amaryllis and you'll see it. So I actually grew it from seed many, many, many years ago. It took 11, and I donated the seedlings actually to the botany greenhouse at the University of Washington, and they grew it on, and it took 11 years for us to get the first flowers. And when it flowered, it was beautiful. I was actually going to mention the plant here, and so you could see it in bloom, but it's very tricky to grow it as a houseplant because you need the right temperature, the right soil, in order to get it to flower. But the plants now at the greenhouse, though I remind them, like, text me when it's blooming. And it's just gorgeous. And so, look it up online and you'll see it's not like a blue, like true blue, Amaryllis, but it's quite stunning. And what's even more stunning is the pictures of it in the wild, because it's actually endangered in the wild. That I think it might be the new thing that these houseplant influencers are going to come after. But I would hope that they would look at the conditions of where it's growing and understand its scarcity to make sure that they're not promoting a plant that's going to promote wild collections, because that's another thing too to keep in mind with a lot of these rare plants, is there's still plant poaching occurring, believe it or not, especially of these rare and unusual plants, to meet the demand of the market, that the forage, and pillage from the wild these rare and unusual plants. So yeah, I don't know, it doesn't really answer your question, but there's a lot of things that are like, oh, that looks nice, it would be nice to have, but I think I can say that, I'm good. I've got a lot of things to take care of already.
Thank you. I've recently joined the Pacific Bulb Society. They have a forum, and I've heard that plant mentioned.
Yes.
So there are
Oh,
some people,
yes.
there are some people that are growing it. And
Mhm.
actually, if you're, those of you who are listening are interested, that's a good forum to, if you're interested in that type of plant, to learn more about them. I like just listening because I don't grow most of the things, but it's interesting just to read what other people have to
Oh,
say.
it's very informative. Yes.
Yeah. So somebody asked where you find out where plants have changed genus.
Oh, so when you're like me and you just sort of live and breathe, like you have no life, or you live under a rock, it just, pops up actually. I would say like Wikipedia, for example, like, so let's say I'm, looking for more information about, Sansevieria or something like that. And then, yeah, it turns up and like, oh, it's not showing up in Wikipedia as Sansevieria. It's actually, Dracaena now. And a lot of it is just, random like fluke, and that's where I think social media can play a role when someone's talking about it, whether it's presented in a way as like, oh, it's a different genus now. They've done the DNA work to determine that such and such plant is now this. Or, as I often will hear about it, it's a rant or a complaint about, from a fellow gardener about like, oh my God, Riz, can you believe that such and such is now, it's different name? And I'm like, I never knew. So that's how I usually find out. So you got to roll with the right people, I guess, to find out. But the thing is, even with these new plant name changes, there will be plants that will forever be the plant that they are known as in the industry. For like for example, like Sansevieria, for example, it's going to be a while before the nursery trade is actually going to change their labels and switch it over to Dracaena. And the big thing in terms of horticulture plants outside.
Unfortunately, you
just like Oregon grape. That's what. Oh,
you.
Am I back?
Yeah, you're back. we lost
okay.
you for a second there, but you're back. That's great. I was gonna say I can tell you a really funny story about genuses.
Yeah, so Mahonius, for example.
I was gonna say, tell you a funny story about genuses. I was on a Native Plant Society trip, and somebody said, "Oh, the primula were really nice." I said, "Really? Had no idea we had native primula around here. We should go look at it." We went up there, and of course, that's what shooting stars are called now. They changed it from Dendromicum. So,
why? Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, with Mahonia, I was mentioning Mahonia. They're now berberis, and I'm like, no, like certain plants will just always be. Rosemary is not even in Rosmarinus anymore. It's a different genus. So anyway, yeah, it's tough.
Trying to keep up. Yeah. Another problem. How do you eradicate mealy bugs on houseplants?
Mealy bugs. Oh, I knew I was going to get a pest and disease question. Good Lord. So most people will resort to, the chemicals and that sort of thing because it's the easiest, kind of more direct way of taking care of them. So I try to be as organic as I can to use the least toxic. And so usually like an insecticidal soap or neem oil actually is sort of the go-to insecticide for mealybug. But honestly, I don't have too many houseplants in that if I do see it, I basically use my hands, maybe gloves if I have gloves, and I just, strip it off and just get it off as much as of it as I can. Or sometimes what I'll do with mealybug or scale is a Q-tip or cotton swabs and isopropyl, just rubbing alcohol, and just treat it by hand and just do it manually. I do it that way because one, it's kind of satisfying knowing that you're just getting all of that out. And also, I'm not relying on a chemical and another expense to go out and buy, a chemical to have to use. So those are the options.
I'm not sure what somebody asked about banana tea, and I don't know what that she's referring to. I think that must have been a typo. And then what the best humidity is, I assume that varies depending on what plant you're trying to grow.
Mm-hmm. And there actually are a lot of plants that like the temperature and like the humidity that we like, you know. So a lot of that is, and again, we're all different. So so for some reason, like I tend to like you know, lightly cooler temperatures, and you know, moderate humidity. Whereas like, you know, my sister, for example, like, you know, like if we're in the car together, you know, she'll complain that it's too cold and blasts up the heat, you know. So again, yeah, it certainly is variable. But the beauty of a lot of the more common houseplants that I talked about, a lot of them like the moderate light and moderate temperatures that we all seem to do well in. So in some ways, if we all were able to gather for the talk and inside and in the presentation, you know, there'll be a good number of plants. It's just figuring out which ones you like and to just try.
Okay, here's the question: is banana tea really good for houseplants?
The banana, I'm assuming, so like the banana, like fruiting banana, like the AA that I talked about, or just the, you know, eating banana that we all you know, see, the more common one. My opinion does not make a good houseplant. You can try, you can certainly succeed if you can get the temperature right, and if you can fight the mealy bug. For me, banana is, oh gosh, mealy bug magnet and mite magnet as well. It's just tricky. They're very labor intensive. And of course, when you have those large leaves, that's a lot of mealybug to have to clean up. As lush and as beautiful as it can be, it's doable, don't get me wrong, or you might try. I don't want to discourage anyone from trying it. But it's tricky. And plus it does require quite a bit of light. And if you're growing it for the foliage, I think you could be okay. But if you're trying to get fruit, I don't think it's worth it to try to grow it inside unless you have a greenhouse.
Okay, and maybe Dachshund, if you want to unmute yourself, I have no idea what the apple in the bag is about. So
all right.
Like
well, I was commenting on the Talanzia blooming question. Some say, you know, you can use a ripe apple to supply the, I guess, the ethylene gas.
Yeah.
To kind of promote blooming. If it's, you know, very shy, you can sort of give it a kick. So that was
you have
just
to put the
that's
Talanzia in the bag with the apple.
Yeah, well, you just supply you put it next to it, I guess, or enclose it, but give it a little ethylene
calcium
gas.
carbide. Suzanne had mentioned too. I'm not familiar with calcium carbide in doing that. What's interesting, you mentioned that too with ethylene gas, because how I learned about ethylene and blooming is like when I'm forcing tulip bulbs, for example, they say to not keep it with like ripening like fruit, like, you know, in the fridge, whatever, because it can, you know, abort the, you know, the bloom. But maybe it, you know, it is, you know, different in, obviously it is different in different plants. But that's interesting because again, as you know, I love my Talanzias as they are. I never, you know, they just bloom and, you know, when they can. But I guess in order to do so, you can do something like that technique to get them blooming. Oh, that's new to me. No, thanks for sharing that.
Thank you,
No
Dr.
problem.
I think that's it for questions. If anybody else has a question you haven't put in chat, if you want to, you can unmute yourself and ask it at this point.
Well, I got a question. Why no palms or cycads?
Why no palms or cycads? Well, I kind of mentioned one. One, I don't really grow any, so I feel like I couldn't really vouch for, you know, oh, like, you know, like a really good palm, and plus they're expensive. But I will say though, in terms of palms, here in the Northwest, we have the hardy, you know, palms, trachycarpus, you know, sort of deal, which I absolutely love. But indoors, so at work, we have a large pool area where it's an enclosed space that they wanted to make look very tropical. And so we basically tried a lot of different types of palms because we could get them pretty large. The ones that have done well for us, Rafis palm was probably the one that's the most adaptable, that's done very well for us, and the Kentia palm, another very common houseplant, is another one that's doing quite well in terms of humidity, slightly cooler temperatures than ideal, but very adaptable. So those would be like the two that I'm probably the most familiar with. That if I were to get a palm for here, I would probably go with the Rufus palm or the Kentia. And of course there's others out there too that do very well. And of course there, good Lord, you have so many different types to choose from that even you can grow outside there. So yeah, I'm not your palm guy, but don't get me wrong, I do love them. So maybe when I do this talk again, I'll bring it up because, again, it's another classic, iconic houseplant and tropical plant that people would expect. So yeah, thanks for mentioning it.
Thank you.
There are so many plants. I don't know how you even pick out what you want to talk about. You got a nice sample of what was most common. Dachshund, did you have another question?
Well, I'm okay. Yeah.
Okay. And I think we all have our passions. Mine happens to be Hoyas. So.
Yeah, see, I did have a Hoya at one point. Well, what do you recommend, Janet? What's your favorite Hoya? I'm assuming, can you grow them outside there, or are they strictly indoors for you?
I grow them indoors. I have
okay.
Them outside.
What's your, so let's say I've grown Hoya in the past and sadly gave it away. But yeah, if you were to recommend a go-to Hoya for the houseplant novice, what would it be?
Just the regular Hoya, and I can't remember the species. But,
Carnosa.
And
Hoya
then also
Carnosa.
Carnosa, right? Carnosa and obtusifolia is pretty easy to grow. Also, I found the round-leafed one.
Okay.
Fishtail Hoya is really difficult.
Ah.
I've had one of those that's been struggling for I think 20 years now, and I finally just cut the tips and repotted it.
Nice.
Yeah, a lot of Hoyas have fragrant flowers. Yeah, that's nice.
Yes, very fragrant. And at night is when they're fragrant.
Yes, so I'm a big fan of fragrance.
But
there's not that many fragrant houseplants.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's why, I'm a big fragrant plant. So that's one of my criteria for getting a new plant. So it's a big plus if it's scented. So yeah, Dachshund, do you have a favorite of indoor plant that's fragrant?
Well, I got one for you. It's a Chlorensis spicatus. I showed it to a Western Hort once. It's called chicken feet orchid, the common name in Chinese.
Oh, okay.
It's in its own family, Chlorensis Acea. Yeah.
Oh, Chloranthus. What's the species again?
Chloranthus. Chlorensis. The one I grow is spicatus.
Spicatus. Okay, I'll look that up.
Yeah, there's another one called erecta. So both of these are really good.
Okay. And what kind of conditions do you have them growing in?
Well, they're slightly tender, but I can grow them outside. So as long as you don't get frost on them.
Out there you can.
Yeah. Well, let's see, but they're very good house plants, so they don't really need much care.
Okay, and in terms of light and humidity,
because they would prefer high humidity, but they can do with less.
Okay.
And they don't need strong lights.
Oh, I'm just Googling this right now. I have seen these before. Okay, well, good to know. See, you had me at fragrance, so thank you.
Well, I can give you some cuttings. They're very easy to root. Yeah,
okay. Oh, good to know. Well, speaking of fragrant plants too, I also have several favorites, but I grew up with Jasmine Sambac, which is the Arabian jasmine.
Right.
And in the Philippines, we call it sampaguita, and it's actually our national flower. And in China, it's Moly Hua, which is the jasmine that they grow for jasmine tea. So I love that fragrance, but it's a tricky. Well, there's one that's pretty easy to grow generally, but we grow the very double form, and that needs good light, fertilizer and it's just almost too troublesome, but I love the scent of that. And I also grow Cymbidium orchids as well. A lot of the Chinese Cymbidiums, Encephaliums, the species. I actually grow a few, and I've yet to have them flower, but the fragrance on those is enchanting. So yeah, and of course the orchids, many fragrant species. So to grow. So yes, fragrance, very, very important.
Yeah, that's Dachshund's thing. Definitely his thing.
Yeah.
Nice.
Or if you ever go down to Southern California, I can recommend another dwarf magnolia for you. It's called Magnolia Coco, and you can Google that.
Oh, I have that's
okay.
made, yes, that's it's made its presence amongst my plant aficionado friends. I have my
Okay.
buddy Scott Wu. He's a magnolia fanatic, and we're also blessed to be able to grow a lot of the evergreen broadleaf magnolias here in the Northwest too, like Magnolia Maudier. I have one friend growing Dosopa, and of course Michelia Figo. Figo is actually I was introduced to as a houseplant, the banana shrub as they call it. That one, yeah, that's another mealybug magnet, but the scent is wonderful. And can you guys grow that outside in
Yes,
your?
it does grow outside the Bay Area. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, lucky.
So, somebody asked whether you move your plants in and out depending on the weather and the rain.
So yes, actually, I am a big fan of plants that, especially during the summer, to have a lot of my house plants out in the summer. One, it helps because of watering. I'm not having to take care of so many plants where I can let the rain, water. But I think it's important that they do, so they get fresh air. And also another thing too that I didn't stress in the talk, but I want to stress here, is air circulation. Air circulation is so key and so important in growing a lot of plants, particularly house plants, to help with pests and diseases, and just air, moving air that they would get in the wild naturally. So I love, like all my Aspardistras, for example, if they bring them inside for the winter, they're always outside underneath the trees, underneath the eaves, outside. During the summertime. And also one of my favorite ferns, so I've been collecting the genus Pyrosia, which are the tongue ferns. This is a form of Pyrosia lingua, and one of my favorites I have back here is Pyrosia schirrii, which I absolutely love. The undersides are beautiful. So this I can grow inside and out, but definitely outside, in the summertime, where they get the good air circulation and are watered by the rain, and they put on wonderful growth while they're outside as well. So yes, I encourage that those that are in colder climates to bring their houseplants out in the summer, but to be careful though, to keep them closer to the house, because sometimes when you bring a plant that's been inside, outside, and the light levels very drastic, very different, you could cause some damage to the plant tissues. So it's a gradual move from indoors, outdoors.
Okay, great. I think that covers all of our questions. Somebody asked what you recommend for fertilizer.
Yes, okay, I'm waiting for the fertilizer question. So I tend to be very lean, or let's just say lazy, when it comes to fertilizing. I need to do a better job with fertilizing my plants, and I think I'll have more robust, more extensive growth. But as in my training, in my education as a horticulturist, I've always been told that yes, fertilizing is important and it's key, but in the landscape, fertilize only when it's necessary. That's been kind of the mantra that I've been taught. So for example, when we're planting out in the garden, especially like trees and shrubs, for example, it's been a common practice to recommend to amend the soil. And I only amend when it's necessary to amend is basically what I've been taught, and I'll only fertilize when it's needed. So that's been kind of my approach. So knowing that houseplants are in containers, that they're watered on a regular basis, and sometimes nutrients do leach out that you need to replenish, fertilizing plays an important role. And it depends on plants, because like things like orchids, for example, are very light feeders and don't require a lot of fertilizer. But then the other plants, I'll do a mixture usually, depending on the plant. Again, you're gonna hear that again, depends on the plant. Sometimes I'll use a slow release fertilizer like Osmocote, very common and readily available. I'll use that as sort of like a base to know that it's there, that during warm weather and I water, that it'll get a little bit of feeding. But for me, I usually will use an organic fertilizer that's liquid, or that's I buy concentrated and just dilute and then water it in a solution form. And also I'll admit whatever's affordable and when I need fertilizer and what's accessible, I still carry a bag of just plain Miracle-Gro, to grow. But I'm very stingy when it comes to feeding. Not only, again, feed as necessary. Sometimes I'll dilute the recommended amount, so I don't over-fertilize. And so in some ways, it's better to under-fertilize than over-fertilize, in my opinion. So again, depends on the plant, depends on what I'm utilizing, but it's usually a combination of a slow release or a liquid fertilizer.
Okay, I think that is it. I don't see any more. So thank you very much. It's been a really entertaining and interesting presentation.
Thank you very much.
Covered a lot of ground in a short period of time, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for having me. And I hope I passed the test and I can be asked to speak again, and hopefully in person, so I can meet